Greetings and salutations, fellow nerds. Today is Tuesday. So, we've done a movie week before, specifically a favorite movie review week, but Daniel's never done one of these with us. So, this week our theme is movies. Nothing more specific than that, just movies. Now, I'm a huge old-school monster movie buff, and I decided that I wanted to do a brief history of either Godzilla or the Universal monsters. It was really hard for me to decide, but I decided to go with the American batch. So this week, I'm doing a brief history of the Universal movie monsters. So, Universal Pictures was founded in 1912 by a guy named Carl Laemmle, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. And a year later, they released their first horror movie, or at least the first one that was lumped in the Universal monster movie thingy, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It was a silent version. At the time, they hadn't invented the talkie yet. The talkie, of course, being a film phrase back then for non-silent picture. But in my opinion, the first good one that they released was the 1923 version of The Hunchback of Notre Dame with Lon Chaney playing Quasimodo. Lon Chaney Sr., for those of you who don't know about the older films, was probably the best silent film actor in the history of silent films. Both of his parents were deaf, so he learned how to pantomime pretty quickly. Not to mention, he was a master at applying makeup. And since you kind of had to do your own makeup back then, because films weren't as big a deal as they are now, good skill to have. 2 years later, Lon Chaney starred in possibly the best film adaptation of the Phantom of the Opera ever. And probably my favorite Lon Chaney movie. It wasn't until the 1930s, with the invention of the talkie, that we kind of met some of the horror movie monsters that we know and love today. In 1931, Universal released Dracula, with Bela Lugosi playing the role of Count Dracula. The same year, they released Frankenstein, with Boris Karloff playing Frankenstein's monster. An interesting little side note about these films is that Bela Lugosi was originally offered the role of the monster, but he turned it down because he felt that the monster didn't have enough lines and his strong suit was talking. So Boris Karloff picked up the role. A lot of people think that this is where the Boris Karloff-Bela Lugosi feud started, even though, to this day, I haven't read anything that suggests that they had a rivalry outside of the tabloids saying, oh, they're having a rivalry. In 1932, Karloff played one of Universal's most iconic monsters ever, the Mummy. It's worth pointing out that this Mummy is a lot different than the Mummy that a lot of people remember, which was also done by Universal. The Mummy that a lot of people remember was silent and ran around killing a bunch of people, yet the Mummy that Boris Karloff played was neither of those things. He talked quite frequently, and I don't think he killed anyone throughout that entire movie. In 1933, Universal released The Invisible Man, and throughout the rest of the 1930s, Universal released 2 more Frankenstein movies, with Karloff returning to play both times, and another Dracula movie, Dracula's Daughter. The 1940s was pretty much the decade of sequels and remakes, as they released 3 more Invisible Man movies, 4 more Mummy movies, 2 more Frankenstein movies, and 2 more Dracula movies. But the 1940s are worth bringing up for 3 big reasons. The first of which was that we met another one of our iconic monsters, the Wolfman, which was released in 1941, starring Lon Chaney's son, Lon Chaney Jr. The 1940s also saw the first Monster Mash movie. In 1943, Universal Pictures released Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. It's kind of interesting to point out that in this movie, Bela Lugosi played Frankenstein's monster, the same role that he turned down over 10 years ago. Also, in 1948, Universal Pictures released Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which was the first of 4 Abbott and Costello movies where they interacted with the classic Universal monsters. Sadly, the 1950s was the last big year for the Universal movie monsters. In 1951, Abbott and Costello met the Invisible Man. In 1953, Abbott and Costello met Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And in 1955, Abbott and Costello met the Mummy. Unfortunately, those were the only times where those monsters were seen in the 1950s, or at least by Universal. But Universal Pictures had one more trick up its sleeve. In 1954, they released The Creature of the Black Lagoon. The Creature is viewed by many experts as the last iconic Universal movie monster, and he went on to star in 2 other films throughout the 1950s. After that, Universal quit producing the classic horror movie monsters, but their legacies live on. Between 1957 and 1974, Hammer Productions, an English film company that specialized in horror movies, released 8 Dracula movies, 7 Frankenstein movies, 4 Mummy movies, 2 Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde movies, a Wolfman movie, and a Phantom of the Opera movie. Sadly, Hammer Films never picked up The Creature of the Black Lagoon. In 1974, Mel Brooks released his iconic parody, Young Frankenstein. In 1986, the first Castlevania video game was released, which had many of the classic Universal monsters as villains, even having Count Dracula as the main villain. In the 1990s, a couple of these movies saw remakes, most iconically of those being the Frankenstein remake and the Dracula remake. Today, we see these monsters all over the place around Halloween, appearing everywhere from TV commercials to children's costumes that, hey, even cereal boxes. But thankfully, it's easier to find these movies now more than ever. All you have to do is go to Google and you can find these movies where you can watch them online, and every Halloween they sell big packs of about 50 classic horror movies for about $20. I've indulged in this a couple of times. That about does it for my video this week, and I'll see you tomorrow.